I watched them laugh at me while I buried my mom. They called me weak while I knelt at her grave, tears falling into North Carolina soil. But what my wife and her family did not know was that the broken man they mocked in that cemetery had just inherited $100 billion, and every insult they whispered was about to cost them everything they had spent their lives building. Before we move on, tell me in the comments which state you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode may touch a story that is still unfolding. At the Charlotte Cemetery, Darius Mitchell knelt beside his mom's coffin as workers lowered it into North Carolina soil, tears streaming down his face in raw grief that he could not contain. Around him stood his wife, Anna, and her family, the Montgomerys, whispering their cruel judgments even as he mourned the woman who had raised him alone. "He has always been this weak," Anna's sister Amani muttered, shaking her head in disgust. Their mom, Celeste Montgomery's voice carried clearly across the grave. "Poor woman died broke, and now her son is just another burden on our family." Every cruel word reached Darius's ears, but he remained silent, simply placing his hand on his deceased mom's coffin one final time. The October morning felt colder than it should have been. Gray clouds hung over the cemetery like witnesses to betrayal. His mom, Lorraine Mitchell, had worked as a housekeeper for 40 years. She had cleaned offices in downtown Charlotte while raising her son in apartments that never felt permanent. She had died in a Medicaid facility with nothing but memories and a second-hand Bible on her nightstand. But their arrogance was about to confront a reality that even in their wildest nightmares they could never have imagined. The funeral at New Hope Baptist Church had been mercifully brief. Fewer than 30 people attended, most of them elderly women who had known Lorraine from her cleaning jobs. Darius sat in the front pew, his dark suit wrinkled from sleepless nights, watching as Reverend Thompson spoke generic words about faith and perseverance. Behind him, he could hear the Montgomery family's whispered commentary cutting through hymns and prayers. Celeste Montgomery, 60 years old with silver locks styled to perfection despite the somber occasion, shook her head with theatrical disapproval. "Look at this church. I have seen nicer venues for community potlucks." Her son Marcus chuckled softly, his expensive suit rustling as he leaned closer to his mom. "At least it will not last long." Not much to say about a woman who never accomplished anything worth remembering. Anna sat beside her husband, but felt miles away. Her designer handbag clutched tightly in her manicured hands, her expression one of barely contained embarrassment. She had fallen in love with Darius 9 years earlier, drawn to his quiet strength and refusal to compete with louder men for her attention. But 9 years of her family's constant criticism had worn down her defenses, replacing romantic idealism with practical concerns about wealth and social standing. The burial unfolded with mechanical efficiency. Workers moved with practiced precision, lowering the simple casket into earth that would hold Lorraine Mitchell forever. When the brief ceremony concluded, Darius stepped forward, his legs unsteady beneath him. The weight of 37 years crashed down as he knelt beside the grave, his composure finally cracking. Sobs racked his body. 9 years of suppressed emotion poured out in ragged gasps. He pressed his palm against the coffin, feeling the finality of loss settle into his bones. This was his mom, the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities she never had. She had whispered stories about patience and dignity during their hardest nights. Now Lorraine Mitchell lay silent forever, and Darius felt more alone than ever. "Jesus Christ, look at him!" Amani's voice sliced through his grief like ice. She stood 15 feet away with her family, her tone dripping with disgust. "He is crying like a child. It is embarrassing." Celeste adjusted her pearl necklace, her voice loud enough to carry across the cemetery's open space. "Lorraine died broke, and now we are stuck with this mess of a son-in-law. The man cannot even grieve with dignity." Marcus adjusted his gold watch, his corporate attorney confidence evident in every gesture. "Thank God the old woman is finally gone. At least now we do not have to pretend this family has any respectability left." Their words carried easily across the cemetery. Other mourners shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether to intervene or retreat. But Darius heard every syllable, each insult designed to wound him at his most vulnerable moment. Darius remained motionless beside the grave, his hands steady on the coffin even as the Montgomery family's cruelty washed over him like poison. He would remember this moment. Every word, every sneer, every calculated blow designed to break what remained of his spirit after burying the only family he had ever known. The burial concluded with workers beginning their task of covering the grave with North Carolina soil. Family members scattered toward their cars, eager to escape the uncomfortable scene they had created. Darius remained kneeling until the very end, watching dirt fall onto polished wood, feeling pieces of his old life disappear with each shovelful. Only when the workers began packing their equipment did he finally rise, his knees stiff from the cold ground and the weight of grief that had pressed him down for what felt like hours. That was when he noticed the woman in the expensive suit standing beneath a distant oak tree, watching him with patient intensity. The stranger approached slowly, her silver hair catching the late morning light, her leather briefcase suggesting importance and authority. When she reached Darius, she extended a thick envelope with formal precision that felt rehearsed. "Mr. Mitchell," the woman said quietly, her voice carrying decades of legal experience. "I am attorney Simone Caldwell, your mom's private counsel. She instructed me to give you this after the burial." Her words felt surreal given the modest circumstances of his mom's life and death. Darius accepted the envelope with trembling hands, his name written across the front in his mom's careful handwriting. The sight of those familiar letters made fresh tears blur his vision. "Your mom was quite specific about the timing," Simone continued, glancing toward the departing Montgomery family with an expression that might have been contempt. "She said you would need this most when you felt most alone." The lawyer's eyes held something that resembled both sympathy and anticipation, as if she knew secrets that would soon change everything. "Call the number inside when you are ready, Mr. Mitchell, but not until you are completely ready." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Darius alone beside his mom's grave with an envelope that felt heavier than it should have. Inside the car during the silent drive back to their apartment in South Charlotte, Darius sat in the passenger seat while Yana drove, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. The envelope remained unopened in his jacket pocket, its presence both comforting and mysterious. Behind them, Celeste and Marcus followed in their Mercedes, no doubt continuing their analysis of his inadequacies and their daughter's poor judgment in marrying beneath her station. The Montgomery family had made their position abundantly clear at the cemetery. To them, he was damaged goods, a financial liability married to their daughter through some incomprehensible lapse in judgment 9 years earlier. They had spent nearly a decade waiting for Yana to come to her senses, and his mom's death seemed to represent their opportunity to finally separate their family from his poverty. That evening, alone in the small bathroom of their apartment while Yana spoke on the phone with her mom in the living room, Darius finally opened the envelope. Inside lay a single key and 5 words written in Lorraine Mitchell's steady handwriting. "The time has come, son." The key felt cold against his palm. It was old-fashioned, the kind that opened safe deposit boxes rather than modern locks. But there was no indication of which bank or which box or what secrets his mom had kept hidden throughout her life of apparent poverty and struggle. He sat on the edge of the bathtub, turning the key over in his fingers while his wife's voice drifted through the thin door. "Mom, I know, I understand. Yes, we will talk about it soon, I promise." Darius studied his mom's handwriting, remembering nights when she would write him notes of encouragement before her overnight cleaning shifts. Her penmanship had always been beautiful, careful, suggesting education she had never been able to use for her own advancement. She had cleaned other people's offices while possessing the intelligence to run them. Attorney Simone Caldwell's business card bore only a phone number and the name of a private banking firm in Raleigh. No street address, no email, just a number that suggested discretion and secrets worth protecting. What business could a housekeeper have had with a private bank in North Carolina's capital city? The question gnawed at him as he sat in the bathroom, listening to his wife plan his humiliation with her family, while he held a key to mysteries he could not yet comprehend. The Montgomery family dinner table on Sunday evenings served as Celeste's weekly courtroom, where she presided over conversations designed to reinforce the household's social hierarchy and remind everyone of their place in her carefully constructed world. Tonight's gathering felt different, charged with the aftermath of Friday's cemetery scene and weighted with unspoken expectations about Darius's future in their family. Anna had insisted they maintain the tradition despite Lorraine's recent burial, claiming that normalcy would help everyone process their grief. But sitting across from his wife in the Montgomery family's pristine dining room in their Myers Park home, Darius recognized the evening for what it truly was, an intervention disguised as a family meal. The crystal glasses caught candlelight while shadows played across faces that wore expressions of calculated concern rather than genuine sympathy. This was theater, and he was the unwilling actor in a script written without his input or consent. Celeste Montgomery had spent her 60 years building walls between herself and the poverty of her childhood in rural North Carolina. Her transition from bank teller to assistant branch manager had been methodical, each promotion carefully leveraged into greater respectability and financial security. After her retirement, she had channeled that same ruthless precision into real estate investments, accumulating rental properties across Charlotte's emerging neighborhoods where young professionals were driving up values and creating opportunities for those positioned to exploit them. The modest fortune she had built served as both shield and weapon, protecting her from past humiliations while enabling her to inflict new ones on those she deemed beneath her current station. She wore her success like expensive perfume, ensuring everyone in her presence understood exactly where they ranked in her carefully constructed world. Tonight, her silver locks were styled with particular care, her black dress chosen to convey both mourning and authority. She waited until the main course was served before launching her attack, timing her words with strategic precision that would have impressed any prosecutor. "We need to discuss Darius's situation," Celeste began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Anna, honey, you cannot continue carrying this burden alone. Your husband needs to face reality about his circumstances and what he is capable of providing for this family's future." The words were directed at her daughter, but Celeste's eyes remained fixed on Darius, measuring his reaction like a scientist observing an experiment she had designed specifically to produce predictable results. "Lorraine is gone, God rest her soul, but her death does not change the fundamental problems in this marriage." She paused to sip her wine, allowing the implications to settle over the table like a fog. "Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for someone is help them understand when they are not capable of meeting their responsibilities as a husband and provider." Marcus Sterling, 42 years old with the confidence of a man who had clawed his way from poverty to professional success, leaned forward with his lawyer's intensity. The man works as an accountant for a medical supply distributor. $48,000 a year, no advancement prospects, no ambition to improve his situation or contribute meaningfully to this family's success. He drummed his fingers against the polished table surface, an unconscious tell that revealed nervous energy despite his confident presentation. "Meanwhile, our family has connections throughout Charlotte's business community. Anna could be married to a senior executive, a successful entrepreneur, someone who matches her potential rather than limiting it with his inadequacies and lack of vision." Imani, 34 years old and recently divorced from her own failed marriage, added her voice to the chorus of criticism. "I have watched you sacrifice your happiness for 9 years, sis. You deserve someone who can take you to the places you want to go, not someone who makes you embarrassed to introduce him to your friends and colleagues." Anna shifted uncomfortably beside her husband, her loyalty torn between family traditions and whatever remained of her marriage after 9 years of constant pressure. She had fallen in love with Darius's quiet strength, but her family had spent nearly a decade teaching her to see that strength as weakness, his patience as lack of ambition, his dignity as acceptance of mediocrity. Darius listened to each accusation with perfect stillness, his fork moving mechanically from plate to mouth, while his wife's family dissected his inadequacies with surgical precision. This was not the first such conversation, though tonight's version carried the finality of an ultimatum that could not be ignored or deflected. For 9 years, he had endured similar discussions, each one disguised as concern for Anna's welfare, each one designed to erode his confidence and position within the family structure. But tonight felt different. His mom's funeral had emboldened them, convinced them that their window of opportunity was closing, and they needed to act decisively before Anna's misguided loyalty hardened into permanent commitment. "I think," Celeste concluded, setting down her wine glass with theatrical precision, that we need to consider a trial separation. Give everyone space to evaluate what they truly want from life and what kind of future they envision for themselves. Her smile carried all the warmth of winter moonlight. Darius, surely you can see that this arrangement is not working for anyone involved. The kind thing, the decent thing, would be to step aside gracefully and allow Iana to find happiness with someone who can actually provide for her future and give her the life she deserves. The key in Darius's pocket seemed to grow heavier as his wife's family dismantled his marriage with business-like efficiency. Tomorrow, he would call the number attorney Simone Caldwell had given him and discover what secrets his mom had hidden for decades. Tonight, he simply nodded and finished his dinner in silence, storing every insult for future reference. The Raleigh private banking office occupied 3 floors of a glass tower that reflected autumn clouds like mirrors of heaven and earth. Darius had expected something more traditional, perhaps oak paneling and leather chairs that whispered of old money and established power passed down through generations. Instead, he found himself in a stark modern space where minimalist furniture suggested wealth so secure it required no ornamentation or display. The receptionist's smile was professionally warm, but her eyes held the calculating assessment of someone trained to distinguish between legitimate clients and curious interlopers who wandered in from the street. When he presented his mom's key, however, her demeanor shifted into something approaching deference that caught him off guard. She made a brief phone call, spoke in hushed tones he could not quite hear, then escorted him personally to an elevator that required a special card to operate. The ride to the 40th floor felt longer than it should have, silence pressing down with the weight of anticipation and unanswered questions. Attorney Simone Caldwell waited in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking North Carolina's capital city. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense suit. She was perhaps 62, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades managing other people's secrets and protecting fortunes that existed in shadows rather than spotlight. The briefcase beside her chair appeared to contain documents thick enough to chronicle a lifetime of carefully planned transactions and strategic decisions made over decades of patient accumulation. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying traces of an expensive education and years of legal practice at the highest levels. "Your mom spoke of you often. She was quite proud of your patience and dignity, though I suspect she never explained why those particular virtues were so important to her plans for your future." The safe deposit box required 2 keys to open, his mom's key and another that Simone produced from her briefcase with ceremonial precision. Inside lay documents that challenged everything Darius thought he knew about his family's circumstances and his mom's life of apparent poverty. Corporate registration papers, offshore account statements, trust agreements written in language so complex it might as well have been a foreign language designed to confuse anyone who tried to understand without legal expertise. But the numbers were clear enough. Assets totaling $100 billion distributed across shell companies registered in Delaware, the Cayman Islands, and Luxembourg. Holdings that included debt portfolios, equity stakes, and contractual obligations involving hundreds of American businesses across multiple industries and sectors. His mom had not died poor. Lorraine Mitchell had died controlling a financial empire so sophisticated that its true scope remained hidden even from the institutions that served it and the businesses that depended on it. Your mom was one of Wall Street's most brilliant financial minds during the 1980s, Simone explained, spreading documents across the polished conference table like a card sharp, revealing a winning hand that had been decades in the making. The scandal that supposedly destroyed her career was carefully orchestrated theater. She liquidated her visible assets, accepted public disgrace, and used the resulting anonymity to rebuild her fortune through nominee directors and shell corporations that bore no trace of her involvement. She paused, studying Darius's expression with professional interest that suggested she had been waiting years to witness this exact moment. "Everything you see here was constructed during the 30 years the world believed her to be a failed investor living in poverty and cleaning offices for minimum wage. She said you would need to experience genuine humiliation before you could properly understand the value of what she was leaving you and the responsibility that comes with this kind of power." The legal mechanism was breathtakingly complex. Lorraine had created a trust structure that functioned like a spider web, with each strand connected to dozens of others in patterns that would take forensic accountants years to untangle and understand completely. Companies owned other companies that held debt on businesses that reported to entities registered in jurisdictions chosen specifically for their privacy protections and favorable tax laws. The system was entirely legal but virtually invisible, protected by layers of attorney-client privilege and international banking regulations that made investigation nearly impossible without cooperation from multiple governments simultaneously. More importantly, it was designed to be activated by a single signature, Darius's signature on documents that would transfer operational control from nominee directors to their true beneficiary and rightful owner. I took the liberty of researching your wife's family financial situation, Simone continued, producing a second folder with the efficiency of someone who anticipated every question and had prepared answers in advance. Marcus Montgomery owes approximately $700,000 to Piedmont Capital Holdings, one of your mom's Delaware entities, for the loan that allowed him to establish his law firm 8 years ago. The terms include immediate recall provisions if the borrower's professional standing is compromised in any way. Her fingers traced lines on a document that detailed every transaction. Celeste Montgomery has invested her retirement savings in 4 real estate projects financed through Carolina Investment Group, another subsidiary your mom controlled. The properties are profitable, but the financing agreements give the lender extraordinary control over management decisions and profit distributions. Simone's smile held the cold satisfaction of a chess master revealing checkmate. Both arrangements were structured to appear routine while maintaining ultimate control in your mom's hands. They have been entirely dependent on your family's resources for years without realizing it. Every success they celebrated, every achievement they used to mock your poverty, was built on money your mom controlled from the shadows. Darius felt the world tilting beneath him as implications cascaded through his consciousness like dominoes falling in elaborate patterns. Every slight, every insult, every moment of manufactured humiliation had been delivered by people who were financially beholden to his family's hidden empire. The Montgomery family's wealth, their social position, their ability to look down on him with such confidence, all of it existed at his mom's sufferance. More unsettling still was the realization that Lorraine had orchestrated this revelation deliberately, timing it to coincide with maximum emotional impact. His mom had watched him endure 9 years of systematic belittlement while possessing the power to destroy his tormentors with a single phone call. She had allowed him to suffer, to grieve, to feel utterly alone at her funeral while the truth waited in a safe deposit box in Raleigh. Your mom believed that power without wisdom was merely wealth, and wisdom without humility was merely arrogance, Simone said, beginning to organize the documents into neat stacks that represented different aspects of the empire. She wanted you to understand what it felt like to be genuinely powerless before you inherited the ability to shape other people's lives and determine their futures. Whether you choose to exercise that power and how you choose to exercise it are decisions she left entirely to your discretion and judgment. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table, its language simple compared to the complex trust documents surrounding it. This is an activation form. Your signature transfers operational control to you immediately, giving you authority over every entity, every investment, every business relationship your mom spent 30 years building in secret. You are under no obligation to sign it today or ever. But if you do choose to sign, the consequences will be irreversible for everyone involved. The pen felt impossibly heavy in Darius's hand as he stared at the document that would transform him from powerless son-in-law to master of a financial empire. Outside the conference room windows, Raleigh stretched toward the horizon like a kingdom waiting for its king to claim his throne and exercise authority that had been held in trust for decades. Tomorrow he would return to Charlotte and face the Montgomery family's ultimatum about his marriage and his place in their world. Tonight, he could choose whether to remain the man they had spent 9 years humiliating or become something else entirely, something they would never see coming until it was far too late to protect themselves. The signature took less than 10 seconds. Its ramifications would echo for the rest of their lives. Darius spent his first morning back in Charlotte researching his newfound power with the methodical precision his mom had instilled in him during childhood. The activation had granted him access to a secure database containing detailed financial profiles of everyone connected to the Montgomery family's business dealings. Every transaction, every relationship, every vulnerability that had accumulated over years of careless confidence. What he discovered painted a portrait of systematic corner-cutting and ethical violations that would have impressed any prosecutor looking for easy convictions and career advancement. Marcus had violated conflict of interest rules by representing opposing parties in settlement negotiations, pocketing fees from both sides while neither client realized their lawyer was playing both teams against each other for personal profit. The documentation was meticulous, preserved in loan reporting requirements that Marcus had never bothered to read carefully. Celeste had been reporting rental income selectively to the Internal Revenue Service, claiming maintenance expenses that existed only on paper while hiding cash payments from tenants in accounts she believed were private and untraceable. Every violation was documented in the transparent accounting required by her financing agreements with Carolina Investment Group. Their success had been built on a foundation of small compromises that had accumulated into prosecutable offenses over years of assuming no one was watching closely enough to notice or care about minor infractions. The beauty of his mom's system lay in its patience. Every loan, every investment opportunity, every business relationship had been structured to collect evidence while providing legitimate services that appeared entirely normal on the surface. Marcus's law firm existed because Piedmont Capital Holdings had provided startup funding at favorable rates that seemed too good to refuse. But the loan agreement included detailed reporting requirements that documented every ethical shortcut, every client conflict, every small betrayal of professional standards. Celeste's real estate empire flourished because Carolina Investment Group had identified profitable properties and arranged financing that made her investments possible. But those arrangements required transparent accounting that revealed every instance of tax evasion, every hidden cash payment, every deduction claimed for expenses that never actually occurred. The Montgomery family had built their wealth while unknowingly creating a comprehensive record of their crimes, each violation carefully preserved in files they had never seen and never imagined existed. Attorney Simone Caldwell's Charlotte office occupied a discreet suite in a building that specialized in wealth management services for clients who valued privacy above visibility. When Darius arrived for their scheduled meeting 2 days after returning from Raleigh, she already had 3 specific recommendations prepared for his consideration, each one designed to achieve maximum impact with minimal exposure. Marcus Montgomery's violations are sufficient for disbarment, she explained, sliding photographs of canceled checks and email correspondence across her desk with the efficiency of someone who had prepared similar presentations many times before. The North Carolina State Bar takes conflict of interest charges seriously, particularly when documented this thoroughly with evidence that cannot be explained away or dismissed as misunderstanding. A single anonymous tip accompanied by these materials would trigger an investigation he cannot survive, regardless of how expensive his defense attorneys might be. Her second folder contained Internal Revenue Service forms and rental income discrepancies that told a story of deliberate fraud rather than innocent mistakes. Celeste Montgomery owes approximately $180,000 in back taxes and penalties, assuming the IRS applies standard guidelines without seeking criminal prosecution. An audit would reveal patterns of deliberate evasion dating back 8 years, far beyond the statute of limitations for claiming ignorance or accounting errors. The plan that emerged from their discussion was elegantly simple in its execution. Anonymous tips to appropriate authorities, time to appear coincidental rather than coordinated, supported by evidence that had been legally obtained through standard business relationships that no one could challenge or question. No laws would be broken, no ethical boundaries crossed that might expose Darius to legal jeopardy or public scrutiny. The Montgomery family would face consequences for their own choices, consequences that had been delayed rather than avoided through years of assumption that small crimes committed by respectable people would never be investigated or punished. Darius's role would remain invisible, his involvement undetectable even under the kind of scrutiny that federal investigators and Bar Association ethics committees would bring to their work. Within 60 days, Marcus would lose his license to practice law and face potential criminal charges for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Celeste would confront financial ruin and possible prosecution for tax evasion that could result in prison time for a woman her age. Their carefully constructed social position would collapse under the weight of their own accumulated deceptions, and they would never know that their destruction had been orchestrated by the son-in-law they had spent 9 years dismissing as too weak and too poor to matter in their world of money and status. Anna noticed her husband's improved mood during dinner that evening, though she attributed it to acceptance rather than anticipation of revenge finally arriving after years of patient waiting. "I am glad you are handling this better," she said, refilling his wine glass with what might have been genuine affection or perhaps just relief that he was not making their separation more difficult than it needed to be. "Mom's suggestion about trial separation might actually be good for both of us. Give us space to figure out what we really want from life and whether we can make this marriage work or should accept that we have grown too far apart to continue." She had spent the afternoon browsing apartment listings online, imagining life in a downtown loft where her friends would not have to meet her blue-collar husband or make polite conversation about his modest job and limited prospects. The fantasy appealed to her more than she cared to admit. Freedom from constant embarrassment at social gatherings. Freedom to date men who matched her ambitions and her family's expectations. Freedom from defending choices she increasingly regretted making 9 years earlier when love had seemed more important than practical considerations about wealth and social position. Marcus called his sister that same evening, his voice tight with barely controlled panic that Anna had rarely heard from her confident older brother. "Something is wrong with my operating account," he said, pacing his law firm's empty conference room while reviewing bank statements that made no sense no matter how many times he read through them. "Piedmont Capital is demanding immediate review of our compliance documentation. They are questioning expense reports from 4 years ago, asking for client correspondence I am not sure I can provide without exposing conflicts I thought would remain private forever." His hands shook as he shuffled through files that suddenly seemed inadequate for the scrutiny they were about to receive from investigators who knew exactly what to look for. "Anna, I need you to understand something. If this loan gets called early, if they start digging into my business practices with the kind of detail they are threatening, there could be serious consequences for the whole family. My reputation, my license, everything we have built could disappear if they find what I think they are looking for in my client files." The timing was perfect, Darius reflected, watching his wife process her brother's distress with growing confusion and the first hints of real fear. The Montgomery family had spent 9 years attacking him when they believed he was defenseless and incapable of striking back. But their confidence was about to be tested by genuine adversity of the kind they had never experienced during their climb from poverty to respectability. Anonymous tips had been submitted that afternoon, carefully crafted to appear routine rather than vindictive, providing just enough evidence to trigger investigations without revealing the source or suggesting coordination between multiple complaints. Bar Association investigators would begin reviewing Marcus's client files within the week, armed with specific allegations that would lead them directly to the conflicts he had assumed would never be discovered or questioned. Internal Revenue Service auditors would contact Celeste within 10 business days, requesting documentation for rental income and expenses that would prove impossible to justify under careful examination. The machine his mom had spent decades building was finally grinding into motion, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it now. Celeste's call came 3 hours later, her usually commanding voice reduced to something approaching hysteria that Anna had never heard from her unflappable mom. "I have received notice of a tax audit," she announced without preamble, as if speaking the words quickly might reduce their impact or make them less real somehow. 8 years of records, everything. And they want documentation for expenses I am not sure I can justify without admitting to practices I thought were standard among property investors. The silence that followed was heavy with implications, none of them fully understood yet. "Children, I think we need to prepare for the possibility that our financial situation is about to become very complicated and potentially devastating for everyone involved in ways we cannot predict or control." Darius offered to help research tax attorneys and compliance consultants, his voice carrying exactly the right note of concerned sympathy that a good son-in-law would display during his family's crisis. Inside, he felt the cold satisfaction of justice finally arriving after years of patient waiting and careful planning that his mom had taught him to value above immediate gratification. The Montgomery family was about to discover that the world was far more dangerous than they had imagined, and that their supposed superiority had been built on foundations of sand that would wash away the moment real scrutiny was applied to their business practices. The North Carolina State Bar Association's letter arrived at Marcus Montgomery's office on a Tuesday morning, its official seal marking the beginning of the end for his carefully constructed career. The investigative committee had reviewed anonymous allegations regarding multiple instances of conflict of interest, supported by documentation that painted an undeniable picture of ethical violations spanning 6 years of practice. Marcus read the charges with growing horror, recognizing each incident while unable to explain how outside parties had obtained such detailed evidence of conversations and arrangements he had assumed would remain confidential forever. His secretary found him an hour later, still sitting at his desk with the letter spread before him like a death certificate, his face gray with the realization that his professional life was effectively over. The audit notice from the Internal Revenue Service reached Celeste Montgomery that same afternoon, its timing so precisely coordinated with her son's crisis that coincidence seemed impossible to anyone paying attention. 8 years of tax returns would be examined with forensic detail, including rental income reporting, expense deductions, and cash transaction records that she had assumed would never face scrutiny from investigators trained to find exactly the kind of fraud she had been committing. The $180,000 in unreported income suddenly felt like a mountain rather than a molehill, each hidden payment now transformed into evidence of deliberate fraud, rather than innocent oversight or accounting mistakes that could be explained away. Her hands trembled as she called her accountant, only to learn that he had been expecting this contact for days and had already begun preparing defensive documentation that would prove wholly inadequate against the evidence the IRS had somehow obtained from sources he could not identify or explain. Darius maintained his mask of concerned sympathy with performance worthy of an award, arriving at the Montgomery family home that evening with takeout dinner and offers of research assistance that seemed genuine enough to fool even his suspicious wife. He found them huddled around Celeste's dining room table like survivors of a natural disaster, their usual confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed panic of people facing consequences they had never imagined possible despite years of knowing their business practices crossed ethical and legal lines. Yana paced between the kitchen and living room, her phone pressed against her ear as she tried to arrange emergency consultations with attorneys who specialized in criminal defense rather than the corporate law her brother practiced. The family that had spent 9 years radiating superiority now resembled refugees from their own success, desperate for help from any source willing to provide it regardless of cost. "I do not understand how this is happening," Celeste repeated for the 20th time, her silver locks disheveled from nervous fingers running through them compulsively. "My accounting has always been meticulous. These allegations make no sense unless someone has been watching me for years and collecting evidence deliberately." But even as she spoke, her eyes held the knowledge that meticulous was not the same as honest, that her success had been built on assumptions about privacy that were proving catastrophically incorrect in ways she could not comprehend or defend against. The rental properties that had provided her retirement security were now evidence in a federal investigation that could result in criminal prosecution and financial ruin that would consume everything she had spent decades building. Marcus faced even more immediate consequences that threatened not just his wealth but his freedom. Piedmont Capital Holdings had exercised their right to demand early repayment of his firm's operating loan, citing material changes in the borrower's professional standing that violated their agreement's terms in ways that made recall legally justified. $700,000 was due within 30 days, money he had already spent on office leases, employee salaries, and the German sedan that had seemed so important to his professional image and social status. His clients were already receiving calls from the bar association, warning them that their cases were potentially compromised by association with a lawyer under ethical investigation for serious violations. Within weeks, his practice would be effectively worthless regardless of the outcome of his disciplinary hearing, every client fleeing to attorneys whose reputations were not under investigation by state authorities. The family meeting that night carried the desperate energy of people trying to solve problems they could not fully comprehend or control. Ayana had managed to secure appointments with 4 different attorneys, though none specialized in the combination of tax fraud and professional misconduct that Marcus faced. Celeste had contacted a forensic accountant recommended by her bank, but his initial assessment suggested that defending against the audit would cost more than she could afford to pay even if she liquidated properties at fire sale prices. The Montgomery family's carefully maintained financial fortress was collapsing faster than they could shore up its foundations, each new problem creating additional complications that multiplied exponentially with every passing hour. Maybe, Ayana suggested with the voice of someone grasping at increasingly desperate straws, we should ask Darius to help us figure this out. He works with numbers all day at that medical supply company. He might see patterns we are missing or understand financial strategies that could help us survive this crisis. The irony of turning to the son-in-law they had spent 9 years dismissing as inadequate was lost on none of them. But pride had become a luxury they could no longer afford in their current desperate circumstances. Darius accepted their request with appropriate humility, offering to review their financial records and research potential solutions to problems he had spent months carefully orchestrating with his mom's hidden resources and attorney Simone Caldwell's expert guidance. 2 weeks later, the dominoes continued falling with mechanical precision that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Marcus received notice that his law license was suspended pending the outcome of his ethics investigation, effectively ending his ability to represent clients or collect fees from pending cases that had represented his income and professional identity. Celeste's audit had expanded to include criminal tax evasion charges that carried potential prison sentences rather than mere financial penalties that could be paid and forgotten. The real estate empire she had spent 20 years building was being liquidated piece by piece to pay lawyers and accountants who offered little hope of avoiding prosecution for crimes that were documented too thoroughly to deny or explain away. The final revelation came when Ayana decided to follow her husband after noticing his increasingly frequent trips downtown to meetings he would not explain in detail. She had expected to discover an affair, some personal betrayal that would justify her growing desire for separation and make their divorce easier to explain to friends who had always liked Darius despite his modest circumstances. Instead, she found herself standing outside attorney Simone Caldwell's office building, watching through glass doors as Darius shook hands with the silver-haired woman who had somehow obtained detailed records of her family's financial crimes and business relationships. The conversation she witnessed was brief but clearly professional, the kind of meeting that suggested ongoing business relationships rather than casual consultations about personal legal matters. Walking back to her car in downtown Charlotte's evening shadows, Ayana felt pieces of an impossible puzzle finally clicking into place with sickening clarity. Her husband's calm acceptance of their marriage problems, his helpful attitude during her family's crisis, his mysterious downtown meetings during the exact period when anonymous tips had destroyed their lives. It all pointed toward a conclusion so shocking she could barely force her mind to accept its implications. The quiet, powerless man her family had spent 9 years humiliating was somehow responsible for their systematic destruction. Outline 10. Ayana confronted her husband that evening with the desperation of someone whose entire understanding of reality had just collapsed beneath her feet. She found him in their apartment's small kitchen preparing dinner with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else, his movements betraying no hint of the power he had been wielding in secret for weeks. "I saw you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make the impossible truth more real than she could bear to acknowledge. "I followed you downtown. I watched you meet with that lawyer, the one who somehow has all our family's private financial records and evidence of crimes we thought were hidden forever." Darius continued slicing vegetables, his knife moving in steady rhythms against the cutting board, but something in his shoulders shifted subtly. A straightening that suggested the conversation he had been expecting for weeks had finally arrived at the moment he had been patiently waiting for. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that had been years in the making, widening with each second of his refusal to deny what she had witnessed. Anna studied her husband's profile, searching for signs of the man she thought she had married 9 years earlier, but finding instead a stranger whose patience had been mistaken for weakness, whose quiet acceptance had concealed calculations she was only beginning to comprehend. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked, sinking into a kitchen chair as the weight of implications settled over her like a shroud. "How long have you been watching us destroy ourselves while pretending to care about our well-being and our family's success?" Darius finally turned to face her, his expression holding neither guilt nor satisfaction, but something far more unsettling. The calm certainty of someone who had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal who he had always been beneath the surface everyone assumed they understood. "Your family spent 9 years teaching me to be invisible," he said, his voice carrying the same measured tone she remembered from their wedding day, back when she had mistaken his stillness for serenity rather than strategy and long-term planning. "You made jokes about my mom's poverty while I buried her in that Charlotte cemetery. You discussed my inadequacies at dinner tables, where I was expected to sit quietly and accept judgment from people who had built their lives on borrowed money and hidden crimes they assumed would never be discovered or punished." He moved to the stove, adjusting the heat under a pot of soup with movements so ordinary they seemed surreal given the conversation's content and the implications of what he was revealing. "I learned to listen very carefully during those years. I learned exactly what you thought of me, exactly how little respect you believed I deserved simply because I appeared to have no money or power to defend myself." The kitchen felt smaller than it ever had before, its familiar surfaces now seeming to belong to a stranger's life. Anna found herself remembering moments from their marriage with new understanding that made her stomach turn. Her husband's inexplicable calm during her family's worst insults, his willingness to endure humiliation without apparent anger or desire for revenge, his strange lack of surprise when her brother and mom's financial disasters had begun cascading through their lives like dominoes falling in carefully planned patterns. "The money," she whispered, pieces of an impossible puzzle finally clicking into place with sickening clarity. "Your mom did not die poor. She left you everything, did not she? All those years of watching us treat you like a charity case, you could have stopped at any time you wanted with a single phone call or revelation." The realization felt like drowning in reverse, air rushing into lungs that had been starved for truth without knowing it. Darius's smile held no warmth, no invitation to shared understanding or forgiveness of past humiliations. $100 billion, he said, the number dropping into their conversation like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would never stop spreading. "Hidden in companies and trusts that your family has been depending on for years without realizing it. Marcus borrowed money from my mom's funds to start his law firm. Your mom invested her retirement savings in properties my family's companies financed and developed with strategic precision." He ladled soup into bowls with the domestic routine of a man discussing grocery lists, rather than the systematic destruction of his wife's family and their carefully constructed world of wealth and status. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of Celeste and Marcus, their voices carrying the desperate energy of people grasping at solutions to problems they could not solve with money or connections or professional expertise. Darius showed no trace of satisfaction as he set extra bowls on the counter and waited for his tormentors to enter the kitchen, where their fate had already been decided weeks earlier in meetings they knew nothing about. "Darius," Celeste began, her usual commanding presence reduced to something approaching supplication that would have seemed impossible months earlier. We need to talk about options, legal strategies that might help us survive this crisis. Maybe you have seen something in the documentation that our expensive lawyers have missed because they do not understand our family's complete financial picture. Darius served soup to his wife's family with the same quiet courtesy he had shown at 9 years of Sunday dinners, where they had made him the subject of their jokes and dismissal, never imagining he possessed the power to destroy everything they had built on foundations of his mom's hidden generosity and patience. "I am afraid there is nothing I can do to help you," he said, his voice carrying final authority rather than regret or sympathy for their suffering. "Your legal problems stem from choices you made freely over many years. The consequences belong to you entirely, and no amount of research or strategy can change evidence that documents crimes you actually committed." The apartment door closed behind Darius Mitchell with the soft finality of a book ending on its final page. The Sterling family sat in stunned silence around a table where they had once felt powerful enough to mock a man's grief at his mom's funeral, now understanding too late that they had been mocking their own destroyer while he patiently waited for justice to arrive on schedule. If you enjoyed this story, like this video and leave a comment telling me what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to get alerts for new stories like this one. Thanks for watching.